Chapter 12. We flew through the hills of Lupercalia as the sun started to rise. The grass was still slippery from the storm, but Casanova didn't seem bothered by the loss of traction. I took a deep breath and braced myself for what was to come. Our party would be much smaller, but I knew that I could trust Greyback to keep me entertained. As we ventured further into the forest on our way to the battle, the village of Stock was still completely asleep, and only a few birds were tweeting. Nothing made me feel more like a noble savior of Lupercalia than being up before everyone else and gazing on the kingdom that I so lovingly protected. I saw the castle in the distance. Just like before, there weren't any flags flying. In fact, there was nothing to draw attention to the castle at all, though it made sense that the palace would want to keep the king's whereabouts on the down low rather than announcing where he was just before the biggest battle in centuries. As I approached the drawbridge, I could see two figures atop their direwolves. I was struck by just how much the direwolf on the right resembled Casanova. And then I remembered that Casanova was a royal direwolf from the king's wolf's litter. This could only mean that Casanova was actually riding into battle with his own mother. Okay, that was actually pretty freaking cool. Sire, I announced as Casanova came to a stop. The king and Greyback turned around and looked at me, and both men nodded. A thin coating of dew had formed on their armor, like they'd been waiting for a while, but the direwolf's fur was still dry, so they'd probably only walked the ramparts together. I had seen Greyback in his knightly finery before, but it was always a big shock to see just how decorated his breastplate was. The moon silver glittered with gemstones of every variety, and I once again admired the patterns of moons and stars that swirled against the shiny backdrop. I'd never seen the king in his armor before, but he was truly a sight to behold. His helmet was adorned with a small flag on the top of the head in the Lupercalian colors of blue, yellow, and white, and his breastplate was so covered in jewels that there was barely any moon silver visible. It formed a detailed mosaic of the moon goddess holding up a silver sword, and I'm sure that part of its effectiveness must have been how blindingly shiny it was. Sir Henry, the king said, I'm most grateful that you are here. Unfortunately, there is no fanfare for us. All of that was saved for the first knights who left on their challenge. I don't care, I said. We don't need the fanfare. We just need to go and save them. The two decorated knights nodded and smiled. You're a young one, Henry, Greyback said, but a brave one. You're exactly what we need for this fight. Sire, are you sure you want to ride with us? I asked. I may be old, Sir Henry, the king laughed, but I can still wield a blade. And I will not let Lupercalia be overrun during my reign. Greyback nodded in approval, so I made a slight bow. I'm sorry that you missed the celebrations for the other riders as they left. For the battle, Sir Henry, the king said as he and Greyback started across the drawbridge. It was quite a scene. But you were doing more important work, Greyback added. Finding out the meaning of that vampire shelter was critical. Sometimes I feel as if we only allow that fanfare so that the squires have something to do when we all ride into battle. Oh, hush now, the king laughed and then took one last look at the castle. You know, sometimes I'm amazed that I've lasted so many years. Somehow I've always returned to the castle in one piece. I think that's a slight exaggeration, Greyback laughed. One time your tail was barely attached to you. Oh, you know what I mean, the king sighed. I've never had to be carried back by my comrades. I've had a long reign as king, longer perhaps than I should have. What makes you say all this, sire? Greyback asked as he squinted at the rising sun. Don't tell me the battle has you feeling wistful. I am the king, and if I choose to be wistful in what might be my very last battle, then so be it, the king replied sternly and then chuckled. One never knows when death will find you. By all rights, I should have been dead years ago, but somehow I've survived. I have the moon goddess to thank for that, and probably the good people who work in the castle as well. Praise be to the goddess, Greyback replied, and he beat his fist on his breastplate. Praise be to the goddess, I repeated, and I banged my fist on my breastplate too. The king kissed his gauntlet before bringing his fist to his chest and closing his eyes. His lips moved, but whatever he said so quietly that even my wolf hearing couldn't understand him. Greyback's ears twitched in the king's direction, but the old knight didn't look at the king until our leader had opened his eyes again. I still wasn't comfortable with the king riding into battle. Aside from the Fact that he was the king, he was by far the oldest out of our party, let alone the entire army. I couldn't think of a single person in Lupercalia that I knew who was older than the king other than perhaps the magician, but the magician wasn't riding into battle when the healing powers of the entire kingdom were at an all-time low. Sire, I said as we veered right, perhaps it would be best if you stayed at the castle? You could be a comfort to the noblewomen who will probably gather there for news of the war. I've said all this to him already, Greyback sighed. He won't be swayed from this path. Of course I won't, the king laughed. Sir Henry, I understand why you may be worried about me. After all, I am an old man and an old wolf. I don't know how many more fights I have left in me, but Lupercalia is in danger and I am duty-bound to my kingdom. It's the only way that it can be. Of course, sire, I murmured. I understand and respect your devotion completely. I made an oath to fight for the moon goddess, the king added, as well as for my people and for the members of the nobility. I will defend her until the very end, even if I have to die for it. I am not just a wolf, Sir Henry. I am a function of the state. I have been blessed by the moon goddess in her divine plan to become king, and this means that there is some level of sacrifice on my part. But to be able to serve this glorious kingdom has been the joy of my life, and I will cherish each and every moment that I have here. Come, sire, Greyback said gruffly. You're speaking as if you'll never set foot in the castle again. I looked between the two knights. This was the type of warfare these two old knights knew better than most, and maybe I just assumed that would grant them some type of protection. But it was clear that both men were dreading whatever was about to happen. We should review our plan, the king said. I wish we had a better idea of what we'll find when we arrive, but the fact that the vampires are involved at least tells us something. Indeed, Greyback nodded. Still, it's always possible that they have already ensnared some of our men, the king finished after a heartbeat. Goddess willing that they haven't. They won't be expecting us, I said. That will give us an advantage. Let us hope it is enough, the king replied. Greyback, you have the map? Of course, the knight said, and he reached into his sack and pulled out a scroll. Once the knight had unrolled the map, I peeped over his shoulder to see that a route through Yerrick had been marked in red ink. But instead of going in the direction of Lake Gomel, it looked like we were heading west into territory that I'd never even heard of before. The temple that we will be following them to is west of the village of the Obsidian Temple, the king said. Those were my orders, and I conferred with the magician that this locale would be a likely place for the vampires to gather. There is a great deal of moonstone in these areas, and due to the ablation, the area will be extremely powerful. I shuddered as I thought of all those moon knights being lured into an area where they would be weakened even more. It was a hideous plan, and I just hoped we made it in time to warn them of the danger. And of course I hoped I got the chance to kill my share of vampires that day. The journey shouldn't take more than half a day, so we should be there by noon, Greyback said. Plenty of time before sunset. Excellent, the king nodded. And Greyback, I would like to follow the tradition somewhat. We don't have any peasants to see us on the journey into battle, but if you could say a few words to help get the blood flowing, I think that would be just what we need. Of course, sire, the knight replied and then cleared his throat. For the protection of the moon goddess, for the sake of the kingdom, and for the good of all to come. Greyback began in a deep rhythmic voice. I stand before you as an old knight, weathered by time and countless battles. Though my body may bear the scars of the past, my spirit burns with the fervor of youth, and it shall see me through this dark day. Yes, indeed, the king murmured. We gather on this fateful morning, before darkness casts its vile shadow upon our land, to face an enemy unlike anything we have encountered before. Greyback continued. We face one of our own, who has been corrupted by the vampires. Throughout my years of service, I have fought beasts of all kinds. But the vampire, with its immortality and insatiable thirst for both blood and power, is unlike any other. They are our opposite. They are our foil. And we stand as the defenders of light and hope, ready to face the darkness head-on. Amen, I said, because I couldn't think of anything else. Sire, would you like to add anything? Greyback asked. Of course, the king said. In the annals of history, the stories of our forefathers are etched in stone. Tales of valor and heroism echo through the ages. Today we have the opportunity to write another chapter in that grand tapestry, just like the one that stands in our castle. Our swords shall be the quills, our armor the parchment, and our courage the ink that we shall etch into the fabric of Lupercalian history. I was kind of shocked. The sun hadn't even fully risen, and yet it seemed like these two knights were more than ready to give a speech of heroic proportions about a battle that hadn't even happened yet, though I had to admit it had me ready to fight, despite the long ride we still had. Sir Henry, the king said, since there are so few of us, perhaps you would like to add your own words of wisdom. Of course, I said, and then tried to think of something half as eloquent. The night may be long, and the odds might seem insurmountable. I am a new knight, but Lupercalia has given me everything, and so I will fight until my last breath to defend this great land. And furthermore, I am blessed to be in the company of people who have trained for this moment. Our minds are sharpened by past experiences, and you too hold the weight of your ancestors' legacies with grace and nobility as you prepare to face this danger. I am looking forward to creating a legacy of my own, so that the future generations of my family will remember me as the embodiment of bravery and sacrifice, just as you will be remembered by all of Lupercalia. To the moon goddess, Greyback finally roared, and he held up his moon sword. To the moon goddess, the king and I repeated as we lifted our swords to the orange sky. Man, I might have not been able to have any moonbean brew, but something about that speech had really made me ready for action. And that, the king laughed, is how one prepares for battle. Come, let's ride into the forest of Yerrick. Greyback, you will take the lead. Gladly, sire, the knight said as he nudged his dire wolf forward. For a moment I was reminded of the moment when I'd stepped onto the jousting fields for the first time. I could feel the crowd stamping their feet while the musicians played songs of triumph. It had carried me to victory that day, and I knew the speeches I just heard would do the same for me in the upcoming battle. This way, Greyback called as he picked up the pace. As we raced through the forest of Yerrick, I found myself planning what I would need to do once we arrived. I'd had plenty of battles with vampires, and I'd even defeated Wenderoth, so I felt confident that I could destroy any vampire that got in my way. And I would have my moon sword, so even if the moon goddess was weak, I would still have enough magic in the blade to kill my enemies. I just wasn't sure how well it would work on the vampire werewolf, or if Gregoriat would still have his moon sword. I glanced at the king for a moment, and I realized that my mission wasn't as simple as finding Gregoriat and killing him. Once the vampires realized that the king was at the battle, they would try to swarm the old wolf, and I had to make sure that the undead didn't succeed in that plan either. You look thoughtful, the king chuckled when he glanced at me. Just thinking about all the fights I've had with vampires, I said, and remembering the best ways to kill them. Ah, the king said and nodded. I've found that any blow that removes a vampire's head is the best. I'd have to agree with that, I replied with a grin. Do you hear that? The king asked and cocked his head. The birds? I asked after a moment. Redbirds, the king said. It's a sign that the darkness hasn't won yet. I nodded in agreement and let myself focus on the birdsong for a few moments. It was a cheerful sound despite the gray day around us, and I knew the king was right. The rest of the forest went by in a blur, though I could smell rain in the air and hear the fast-flowing waters of a river that was overflowing. Frogs croaked among the reeds, and the humid air left tendrils of water on my fur. Even the direwolves were starting to pant, though Casanova could usually have handled this trip easily. Sire, Greyback said as he turned around, the wolves must drink. We cannot continue with this journey unless they are well attended to. Of course, Greyback, the king said. This humid air has left us all sweltering. I heard a stream behind us, I said. I'd rather keep moving forward, Greyback said as he raised his nose. The king and I sniffed the air as well, and after a moment I finally caught a whiff of fresh water nearby. Over there, I said and pointed toward the scent. I smell it too, the king said and nodded. A short distance away, I could hear the sound of water falling over rocks, and then we spotted a small brook that seemed to sprout from between two tall oak trees. Even in the shade of the deep woods, it sparkled like it was made of liquid crystals. Here, Greyback said and pointed to a spot where the water was calm. We slid off our mounts and led the direwolves to the water. The canines barely even sniffed the cool liquid before they began to eagerly lap up water with their great big pink tongues. "Where are we in our journey, Greyback?" the king asked a moment later. As the king turned toward us, I noticed that a dragonfly had become caught on the tiny flagpole that rose out of his helmet. Its wings were mangled, and its tiny head was bent at an awkward angle. "Sire," I said, "something is stuck on your helmet." "Oh," he asked, and he tipped his head down to me. "Would you remove it?" "Oh, I muttered as I realized it looked like the king was bowing to me. Greyback lifted an eyebrow, but when I looked toward the older knight, he merely shrugged and turned back to his direwolf. I quickly plucked the dragonfly from the king's helmet and tossed it behind us. Even though it was only a tiny creature, for some reason I felt a pang of sadness that it had died, impaled on a tiny flagpole on a piece of armor that hadn't been worn in years. "I may have a drink myself," Greyback said as he crouched by the stream. "The air feels so heavy these days that I find I need to drink more often." "Not a bad idea, Greyback," the king said as he knelt by the water as well. "Aren't you going to join us, Sir Henry?" Greyback asked. "You should drink plenty of water now. There won't be many chances to do that once we reach our destination." "It does look good," I said as I knelt by the water's edge. I lapped up the cold, fresh water from the stream, and as I did so I marveled at Lupercalia's natural beauty. It tasted better than any water I'd ever had, even back home in Jersey, and I hadn't even realized how thirsty I was until I took my first sip. The water tasted so good that I kept going until the flavor suddenly changed. It went from fresh and cool to slightly bitter and salty, and I sat back as I tried to figure out what had changed. I thought I would see some sediment that had been washed downstream, but the only thing that looked different was that it now had a blue color to it. The king gasped, and Greyback jerked back like he'd been stung. Took me a moment, but then I realized the color had to be from the blue blood of a knight. "Dear goddess," the king hissed as he stood up. "Greyback, are you familiar with the source of this stream?" "It's just north of here," the knight said. "Sire, this is the blood from one of our own," the king murmured. "We may already be too late. To your mounts, gentlemen." We scrambled to our direwolves and quickly mounted, though all I really wanted to do was spit until I was dry and then gargle for days. I could still taste the faint metallic taint in my mouth, and I wasn't sure I would ever be rid of that taste. "Sir Henry," the king said. "Yes, sire," I replied and then wiped a hand across my mouth. "I'm sure that you've seen some rather gruesome acts in your time as a knight, haven't you?" he asked. "Yes, sire," I responded. "As you know, I've seen vampire lairs, zombie animals, elephant men. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I've seen a lot of blood and gore during my time as a knight." "As do most knights, Sir Henry," the king sighed. "Unfortunately, those quests rarely prepare you for the horrors of war. You have never seen blood and destruction on the level you're about to see, and sadly, I have nothing to say that can prepare you for it." Chapter 13. Greyback took the lead again, and somehow we were traveling even faster than we had before. We were moving so quickly that I couldn't hear any of the birds in the trees or the squirrels in the bushes. I couldn't even hear Casanova's big black paws hitting the ground. The only thing that I was aware of was my heartbeat, which was pounding like a drum against my armor. I could also feel the heartbeats of my comrades and our direwolves. I'd never felt more like I was in a pack than I did at that moment, and I knew that riding with the king and one of the most decorated knights in all of Lupercalia was a privilege and a memory that I would cherish for as long as I lived. If I lived, that was. The sun rose to its peak in the sky, and I knew that we'd hit the afternoon. Had no idea how many miles we'd traveled, but that didn't matter. We were running on instinct by then, and human concepts like miles had no real meaning. We passed over many different terrains, including a stretch of small shrubs and an area that was almost completely covered in gravel. I didn't even know that the forest of Yerrick extended this far, but it seemed like we were traveling forever. And then I could smell blood in the air, and my heart started to race in response. My hair was standing on end as well because I knew the scent of blue blood, and that was what I was smelling. Greyback finally gave a low whistle, and our team started to drop down to a fast trot and then slowed down completely. I looked around and realized just how much the world had been a blur before. It was almost like having to regain my land legs, and I took in the sights and sounds right around where we'd landed. This terrain was far different to the Yerrick that I was familiar with. Instead of hummingbirds and mossy ground that seemed to bounce under my feet, we found ourselves in a place that reminded me more of a jungle. I was overtaken by the smell of old water and mulch, and the air sat on my shoulders like a blanket. There were bird calls in the distance, but mostly what I could hear were flies and other insects. The place reminded me of a swamp, and I could feel a heavy layer of sweat starting to form underneath my armor. We sniffed the air, but something that felt like a cold hand trailing along my back distracted me. I looked around, but the only people I could see or hear in the area were the three of us. Did you feel that too, men? The king asked, and Greyback nodded. Yes, sire, Greyback said. There's a strange energy afoot here, and we're not far from the temple where the other Moon Knights headed. We are entering dark ground, men, the king said, and a breeze brushed through his long gray fur. Even though his voice sounded grave, his eyes twinkled in the dappled light of the sun. I knew that despite his old exterior, he was just as much a young pup underneath as I was, and what I saw at the moment was a knight who was revving for battle at all costs. We'll need to be more careful from this point on, Greyback said. No more racing blindly through the woods. Is that what we were doing? The king chuckled. I thought you knew where you were going, old man. Greyback looked offended for a moment and then grinned, but the old knight took the lead again. You should be careful who you call old, Greyback replied. The two old knights both chuckled but then fell silent. Large thick leaves creaked in the breeze and vines dangled down to brush against our fur. Every so often I could hear a hissing sound from a branch, and I realized that there were snakes in the trees as well. Where are we? I finally asked. This is one of the more inhospitable areas of Lupercalia, the king whispered, and coincidentally an area rich in moonstone. It's an easy place for the vampires to hide since very few people ever venture here, and there's a suspicion that they also like the heat since their own bodies don't generate as much. Like reptiles, I murmured. We will be near the temple soon, Greyback said. Keep an eye out for traps or any sign of our knights. I'm not afraid to admit that I'm terrified at what we might find. The king sighed. All those good knights. The vampires couldn't have turned the Moon Knights yet, I said. They have to wait for nightfall. The blood we saw just indicates that there was probably a fight. Indeed, the king nodded. Still, we all know that the vampires like to play with their food, and all they need to do is weaken the knights and hold them prisoner until the sun goes down. Then they can do what they want. That's true, I said, and thought about all the vampire speeches I'd had to listen to as I fought one of their kind. But how could they restrain so many knights for so long? We'll know soon enough, Greyback replied. Sire, I murmured a moment later, if it's true they've somehow captured the Moon Knights, well, I can't help thinking that there's only 3 of us. How are we supposed to destroy the vampires when an army of our most decorated knights failed? The goddess will find a way to guide us, the king replied. Of course, I murmured. I wanted to be able to remain calm like the other 2 men, but my nerves felt like live wires that were about to explode. I wanted to run in every single direction at once, but I also knew that chaos was not our friend. We'll need to cut off the head, the king said, both figuratively and literally. You mean the master, I said. I'll rip the vampire's head from his shoulders with my bare hands, Greyback replied. This is my duty, the king replied. It is the reason I'm here. Sire, I protested and then paused. Lupercalia needs you. Even if we defeat the master, the kingdom will still need its king to guide them. Please stay with Greyback. The 2 of you should be the ones to save the Moon Knights. I'll take on the master. Do you think I'm too weak to fight this vampire? The king scoffed. I think we all are, I sighed. He's right, Greyback whispered. We can't take the kind of risks we normally would. And that goes double for you, sire. The king scowled and shook his head. Sir Henry may be young, but he's still new to the knighthood, the king grumbled. But I was brought here by the moon goddess, I said. And while I've never been sure why, I think this is it. I'm here to fight the master so Lupercalia will live on. And a kingdom must have a king. Sire, Greyback murmured and then glanced at the king. He is the noble savior. So he is, the king huffed. Very well. Sir Henry, you shall hunt the master, while Greyback and I free the knights. Thank you, sire, I replied. I won't let you down. I know you won't, the king sighed. If you do, we will all be dead by nightfall. That won't happen, I declared forcefully, though I wasn't nearly as confident as I sounded. Good luck, Henry, Greyback said. And may the goddess protect you. She can't, the king pointed out. She's too weak. Looks like you're saving yourself this time, Henry. And the rest of us too. The king chuckled then, so I realized he was only riding me the way athletes did all the time. No pressure, Greyback huffed. Maybe we should ask him to whip up a cake afterwards, so we can celebrate our victory. The king tooted and rolled his eyes at his old friend, and then he gave me a wink. Greyback has always been such a formal fellow, the king said. One of us had to be, Greyback retorted. I loved that even in the heat of the battle, these two could still tease each other. It was a true bromance, and I just hoped that both men survived the upcoming battle. I couldn't imagine life in Lupercalia without both of them back in their usual spots in the palace. We have our plan, the king said as he swiped a fly from his shoulder. And now I suggest that we put it into action before darkness falls over Lupercalia, and we are significantly weakened. Greyback nodded, and our troop fell silent as the wolves picked their way through the dense vegetation. Snakes still hissed above our heads, and small, furry things darted underneath the feet of the direwolves, but other than the weird tingle and the blue blood, there was no other sign of the carnage that lay ahead. I knew we were probably walking into a chaotic scene, which meant the few plans we had could get tossed right out the window. I could very well find my path to the master blocked by some of his minions, and then it would be up to the king or Greyback to finish the job. Various scenarios ran through my mind, and though my companions were decorated knights who had fought in battles before, I couldn't shake the feeling that the only way Lupercalia survived was if I was the one who battled the master and defeated him. I knew this was the reason the moon goddess had brought me here, and I wasn't about to disappoint her or the other people of Lupercalia. And that of course brought my thoughts to the girls. I could see Sybil's green, piercing eyes and Imelda's glow as clearly as if they were standing in front of me. I thought about Tabitha's goofy sense of humor and the way she threw her head back and laughed when she was doing something that she knew she shouldn't have been doing. Ava was there as well, and it wasn't a stretch to imagine her marching through this jungle just to give the master a piece of her mind. That image brought a smile to my face, which earned me a raised eyebrow from the king. I remembered my parents then, who were proud as hell that Ava and I wanted to take over the bookstore. I wished more than anything that they could see how successful we were now, but maybe they did, and now they were rooting for me in my next battle. But most important of all, there was another little baker on the way. I didn't know if it'd be a boy or a girl, but either way it was going to continue a legacy of knights that had been part of Lupercalia forever, as well as extending the line of the newest members of the aristocracy. A pang of regret nearly knocked me off Casanova, but I told myself I would make it back to the estate, and I would be the one to tell my child the stories about my career as the noble savior of Lupercalia. We're near, Greyback murmured and nodded to the cobblestones that just peeked out from the forest floor. We pulled up for a moment as we watched the woods ahead, but the trees were still too thick to see the temple. The path seemed to disappear into an abyss, filled with buzzing insects and humidity, and for a brief moment I wondered if this was what it was like in the Amazon. I'll take the lead, I said. Their focus will be on me, so you'll have a chance to get to the Moon Knights unseen. I'm not sure, the king started to protest. He's right, Greyback cut in. If he can draw the vampires away, we'll have a better chance of freeing the knights. The king finally nodded, and he and Greyback moved their mounts to the side so I could move to the front. It felt strange to suddenly be ahead of the two old warriors, but it also felt right. Let's go, Casanova, I whispered and nudged the pup forward. The direwolf trotted along the cobblestones, but it was several minutes before the temple's silhouette began to emerge through the dense vegetation. Stood as a sentinel, weathered and worn, and the former glimmering gray stone was covered in layers of moss and ivy. Holy crap, I muttered as I stopped at the edge of the forest. This Lupercalian temple was unlike any I'd ever seen before in the kingdom. Most Lupercalian places of worship tended to be nondescript on the outside, but this one was flanked by giant 10-foot statues of both the moon goddess on the left side and an unidentified knight in full armor on the right side. Columns covered in runes ran around the base, and crystals embedded in the stone still flickered in the light that made it through the trees. The thing reminded me of a planetarium with a square bottom that rose into a large circular dome at the top. I was actually shocked that there wasn't a giant telescope peeping out from the dome, though I hadn't been inside yet, so maybe there was a Lupercalian equivalent inside after all. Here it is, the king whispered. The Temple of Gregoriat. A shiver raced down my spine at the name Gregoriat. All signs were pointing in one direction, and I had a feeling I knew where this was going. Was this part of the forest always so dense and unpopulated, sire? I asked. No, the king sighed. It wasn't. It's only since the house died out that nobody truly comes here anymore. But the house of Gregoriat were not only knights. They were noble followers of the moon goddess as well, and just as many of their men were high priests as they were knights. I couldn't believe this. Something about it was terribly wrong and almost perverse. Everything had become its opposite, like a werewolf turned into a vampire. And here was one of the most loyal, devoted families of the moon goddess, forever connected with some of the most vicious creatures ever to walk the kingdom. It was hard to believe that something like that could have happened to such devoted followers of the moon goddess, but it spoke to just how powerless she was during the oblation. I assume that the moon knights are going to be held outside of the temple until nightfall, Greyback said, given the vampire need for drama. You're probably right, the king said with a nod. The master probably has an entire program drawn up for how the night's events are supposed to unfold. There are too many scents to be sure, Greyback said as he sniffed the air. But I think I smell wolves not far from here. As do I, the king replied. Then this is where we leave you, Henry. I'm assuming the master will be inside the temple. It seems likely, I agreed. I can't imagine he'd just be hanging out in the forest. He'd leave his underlings to deal with things like posting guards and watching for interlopers. We'll use the forest for cover as we circle the temple, Greyback said. Once you attack, we'll move in quickly and free the knights. Good luck, I replied with a nod. And you, boy, Greyback whispered. I waited until Greyback and the king had vanished into the jungle before I nudged Casanova forward again. I heard the pup growl as we neared the temple, but he kept going until we were just outside the door. As we drew closer, I could sense a weird energy in the air. It wasn't exactly like the electricity that sizzled in the air after a lightning strike, but it felt similar. I realized my fur was standing on end again, and when I sniffed the air, I could taste a metallic tang that reminded me of the smell of a forge. Despite the vines that choked the structure, I could tell that the temple had been a beautiful building in its day. The statues could have been carved by Michelangelo, and the stonework was so precise that it was hard to find the seams between the stones. It was a shame to see it in such bad shape, but that was true for any place the vampires took over. I'm going to have to leave you outside, Casanova, I murmured. The direwolf growled gently again, but he nodded to show that he'd understood. He took me up the crumbling gray stone stairs that led to the entrance and then sat down so I could climb off easily. The massive wooden doors were aged and worn, and they stood partially ajar. It was like that scene in every scary movie where the audience is screaming at the idiot not to open the door and walk inside. If only life were that simple. The familiar scent of a vampire lair drifted through the crack, and it was like someone had left old fruit and meat to sit for 1,000 years. It was rancid and dusty, and my nose twitched as I tried not to sneeze. But the place wasn't just dusty. It felt deserted, and even my keen wolf senses couldn't pick up any movement inside the temple. I wondered if Gregoriat had actually left the building in broad daylight, though that went against everything I knew about vampires. On the other hand, Gregoriat's very existence as a vampire werewolf was unnatural, so maybe he still liked afternoon jaunts in the sun. I took one last breath of fresh air before I eased the door open and looked inside. I was nearly knocked backwards by the putrid stink of death, and I growled as I shook my head. Despite all my work against vampires, I still hadn't gotten used to the stench of a vampire lair. Keep watch, I whispered to Casanova. I patted the direwolf and then pulled out my moon sword. I took a step inside, and then looked around. The interior was dusty and dirty, and mold and moss had spread all the way to the ceiling. There was no giant telescope at the center, but there was a random assortment of columns. The placement of the columns was bizarre, like The architect had been smoking something when he designed the place, though I realized it could have also been intended as a maze. I shook my head and looked at the ceiling again as I tried to come up with an easy way to get through the columns. I noticed a piece of cloth dangling from the center of the dome, though it was hard to tell what it was supposed to be. The fabric was so old and faded that it just looked like a moth-eaten rag, and it definitely wasn't going to support my weight if I wanted a top view of the temple. The place was still, like someone was holding their breath, yet I felt like I could almost hear someone whispering nearby. Every time I tried to focus on the sound, though, it disappeared again. I realized I was swinging my head from side to side as I tried to catch the sound, and I forced myself to be still and wait. Suddenly, my right ear started to burn as something hissed nearby. It was so low I nearly missed it, but I knew only one creature that made that particular noise. Something scuttled to my right, and I snapped the blade around as I swiveled toward the undead. The vampire dodged back just far enough to avoid having his head cut off, but then he offered me a menacing Cheshire cat smile. "A wolf is in the temple," the vampire hissed and did a weird little jig. The vampire had the usual gray-green skin and ragged clothing of his kind, and, for some reason, he wasn't wearing any shoes. I could see his yellow and black toenails had grown nearly as long as claws, and I shuddered at the thought of being scratched by one. A mop of scraggly gray hair fell into his glowing red eyes, and the monster bared his teeth when I flashed the blade at him. "Are you another knight of the realm?" he asked. "Did you get lost in the woods? So many knights have come our way this day. I wonder why." He took a few steps forward, but I was ready, not with my sword but with the secrets that Imelda had told me. I did exactly as she had instructed when she told me how to speak the vampire language. I imagined her face in my head, and I imagined the coat of arms when I opened my mouth and thought about what I was going to ask him. "I want to see your master," I thought. But the noises that came out of my mouth were hisses that sounded like the vampire language. It wasn't a pleasant sound to make, and my tongue vibrated against the roof of my mouth with each strange sound that I made. At least I got to see the shock and surprise on the vampire's face. I watched as he looked around the temple like he expected one of the other vampires to leap out and yell surprise, but when that didn't happen, he turned to face me again. "You can speak our language," he laughed and clapped his hands. "I am very impressed." "Take me to him," I said, this time in my normal language. "Otherwise I will kill you." "There's no need for that." A deep growling voice suddenly boomed from the back of the temple. The vampire who had greeted me bowed, and then stepped away from me like he'd learned I was infectious. He scurried back into the shadows, though his footsteps revealed his flight toward one of the distant corners. I looked toward the center of the temple again, but there were so many columns in the way that I couldn't see who had spoken. I frowned at the strange design again while I tried to figure out where in the maze the voice had come from. "Step forward by 6 paces, the voice commanded. I was kind of freaked out by how specific it was, but I had my moon sword in hand, and I knew that if any shit was about to go down, I would fight my way out of it. I counted exactly 6 paces before the columns seemed to disappear behind me as if they were part of an optical illusion, and in front of me was a dark, shadowy figure sitting on a throne. There was a strip of light shining in from a single window behind him, but it seemed as if he had positioned himself so that he could stare at the light without actually stepping into it. My insides started to do somersaults. I knew that something really bad was going on here, but I didn't know exactly what it was yet. Guess I was going to have to find out. "Who are you?" I asked, and the creature on the throne let out a pitiful laugh. I couldn't quite make him out because he was still in the dark, but suddenly he sat up and leaned into the light. I wasn't sure what I'd been expecting, but it wasn't the sickly creature in front of me. He was definitely an unholy fusion of 2 mythical beings, a testament to the dark forces that roamed the shadows of Lupercalia. His lupin features were still intact, but his fur had changed into a sickly gray-green color, and what I could see of his skin had lost most of its color. Long razor-sharp fangs protruded menacingly from his maw, and they glistened with an eerie sheen. They were longer than any werewolf teeth I'd seen, and dried blood stained the tips like he hadn't bothered to clean his fangs in years. His once sleek and powerful body was draped in a tattered cloak, which he removed before stepping fully into the light. His eyes glowed red like most vampire eyes, but there was an insatiable hunger there that seemed to go beyond a need for blood. His stare bored into me, though there was a moment when it revealed more about this strange figure than he realized. I sensed a deep longing in the wolf creature, one that could never be met as long as he was torn between the primal instincts of the werewolf and the insidious desire of the vampire. "Come closer so that I can see you," he whispered. I hesitated before taking 2 steps forward and stopping. I remembered what the king said about how vampires like to play with their food, and while I knew that this still applied to a vampire that used to be a werewolf, something about him radiated an air of sadness that I didn't usually sense from a vampire. "Are you the master?" I asked, and my voice echoed around the building. "The master," he laughed, and he turned his glowing red eyes on me and scratched behind his ear in an uncannily familiar gesture. His movements were both haunting and mesmerizing. There was something very elegant about this creature, even though for all I knew he was the only one of his kind. "Is that a yes or a no?" I asked. "There's no need to be so aggressive," he replied and offered me a shy smile. "We're all just trying to survive." The guy probably thought he was coming across as charming, but the vibe I was getting was definitely creepy. Of course, vampires were expert gaslighters, but this guy was doing a sloppy job if he thought he could win me over with this shtick. But that didn't mean I couldn't play along until I had what I wanted. "Very well," I said. "Perhaps we can talk first." "That's much appreciated, sir," the wolf vampire replied as he scratched his ear again. "But I don't want to be rude, and I'm afraid I don't recognize your Harold. What is your name, pray tell?" I didn't want to tell him my name, but at the end of the day I knew it wouldn't make a difference. I decided to suck it up and let him have it. If I could convince him that I was falling for this weird manipulation, then he would be the one who was blindsided when the shit hit the fan. "Sir Henry," I told him. "My name is Sir Henry." "Ah, Sir Henry," he nodded. "And from where do you hail?" "From New Jersey," I replied. "I've never heard of this place," he murmured and then frowned. "It must have been settled in Lupercalia within the past 300 years. "Yes," I agreed, since I didn't see the point of trying to explain where New Jersey actually was. "Most interesting," he said, and he looked up at me again and met my eyes. "There is so much of life that I never experienced. I have grown old, yes, but at what cost? Not with a life that moves forward. No, a life stuck in time. Life in the shadows. That is not growing old. That is being paused, being stopped from living and forced to watch it." "How did you get this way?" I asked as I lowered my blade just a bit. The wolf grinned for just a moment, clearly convinced that he was winning me over. But then he cocked his head like a dog does when they're listening while he contemplated my question. "I have been this way for 300 years, he said in a suddenly dreamy voice, and his eyes clouded over. "I have been this way since I went out on a mission on that spring day. It was a time in the year similar to this, though I don't often step outside anymore. I only know the time of year by the different sounds of the different birds. I know high spring when I hear it. And winter? That is filled with the long drags of painful silence." He cast his gaze to the ground, and I felt a pit in my stomach. This night's life had been incredibly miserable, and I was almost starting to feel sorry for him. But still, I had to find out what the fuck was going on if I was going to save my friends. "What happened to make you like this?" I asked. "Normal werewolves don't live 300 years. They don't become monsters," he murmured, and he sat back down on his throne. Even though his body was consumed by the dark shadows of the temple, he kept his face in the light where I could see it. "Vampires," I answered. "I went on a quest, same as any young knight," he said. "But I was particularly unlucky. I was sent out on a quest on the night of an ablation. The complete disappearance of the moon." I shuddered, though at least I had confirmation that the ablation was crucial to what had happened to Gregoriat as well as what was planned for this night. "And that's when they turned you?" I asked. "Yes," he nodded. "I was sent into the forest of Yerrick to kill a small nest of vampires. It was supposed to be an easy quest, a day of no consequence. And I remember what the dining hall was preparing for supper that day too. It was to be a leg of roasted mutton, and I imagined that I would return triumphant and sit beside my dear family as I always did. But you didn't make it back, I guessed. Where did you end up?" "Far from the spot that I'd been told to raid," he said. "At first they took me under the ground. They bit me, they made sure that I was unable to fight. And they waited for the moonless night and laid me upon a pyre of opals. Opals that they had been stealing for decades. At the moment of pitch blackness, they imbued my entire body with vampire venom. Took all of them, not just one, but they managed it. My hands were burning, my feet, every vein in my neck. I felt my heart stop, the heart of a wolf. And instead that thud that had accompanied every step from the beginning of my life. It simply stopped. And I became a vessel for their putrid horrors. I had never heard anyone express so much remorse over being turned into a vampire. Well, I suppose Imelda had, but she had formerly been a priestess. Was only to be expected. What happened then? I asked. I prayed to the goddess that I had died, he said, because to become a creature so despised, this type of abomination, well, it seems simply impossible. I thought that I had died, but I had not died. My fate was far worse. I woke up with a thirst in my throat that could never be quenched, and although I drank from the blood of innocence, my conscience was never changed into the conscience of a vampire. I retained my morals, my standards, and had to watch myself descend into the blackness of evil. I took a few breaths as the creature looked down and pawed at his face in a pathetic manner. But there were missing pieces to this story, and I knew those were the critical parts. I had so many questions, but the biggest one was why would he build an army to fight Lupercalia if he hated this new life so much? But why didn't you find help? I asked. Why didn't you return to the castle? You think that the castle would have allowed a creature like me inside? He seethed, and his eyes suddenly started to glow an even fiercer red. You think that they would have been able to change me? I prayed to the goddess every day. And every night. All of my energy was spent trying desperately to pray to the goddess. How do you think I ended up here? In the temple that my family built 1,000 years ago. Do you know what an endling is, Sir Henry? I racked my mind, but I had no idea what he was referring to. An endling? I asked. No, I don't know what an endling is. The last of his family, he said. That's what I am. I have the unique position of being the last of my family and the first of my kind. Quite a miracle, isn't it? I am in the unique position of being an abomination of nature, a vampire and a werewolf at once. I curse the creatures that made me who I am today, that alienated me from all that I ever knew and loved. Not only did they take me, but they brought about the end of my family line in Lupercalia. But then why do you keep Congress with them? I asked. They serve you. They even call you their master. Life is a complicated place, Sir Henry, the master scoffed. You should know that if you want to live in Lupercalia, or anywhere for that matter. Yes, I despise the vampires. But who is there to turn to? The goddess who ignored my prayers and left me in the darkness? I have seen a night with no moon whatsoever, Henry. I have seen a night where the goddess turns away and is nowhere to be found. I know that it exists. She has ignored my plight, and I will never turn to her again. His voice boomed through the temple, and I had to admit that I did actually feel kind of sorry for the guy. He had been taken away from everything that he loved, with nowhere to turn to except those who had victimized him. Back in my Jersey, he probably would have been diagnosed with Stockholm Syndrome and been sent for a shit ton of therapy. But we were in Lupercalia, and his actions were about to destroy everything that was good about the place. So there would be no therapy, just a quick blow from my sword. I'm sorry to hear all that, I said. That must have been, a really hard 300 years. It's been a terrible 300 years, he nodded. Quite terrible. But there was one thing that kept me going the entire time, Sir Henry. You see, in this time where I was stuck in endless contemplation, in an endless loop of misery, I felt inspired. I had a feeling that this was not going to be some kind of feelings-why poetry project to help him process the loss of his former life. Inspired? I asked. In what kind of way? I was double-damned, Sir Henry, he explained. Abandoned by the goddess. Stuck with my hateful captors. Damned to immortality with no family, no warmth, no assistance, and no heartbeat. I was surrounded by death. But then, from the ashes, an idea emerged. What if I were to create life out of this terrible fate? To create more of my kind in my very image? His wolfish, vampire face stretched into a smile, and I had to keep myself from wincing. His long, pointy teeth were yellow and sharp, and I could smell them from where I was standing a few feet away. What do you mean in your image? I asked. I want a legacy, Sir Henry, he replied and then chuckled. I want the lineage that I was robbed of when these putrid creatures took me as one of their own. I thought I would never have children to carry on the family name, or see my sons become warriors even fiercer than me, but now I can have all of that. That's not possible, I said. Vampires don't. Ah, but that's where you're wrong, he said. For we have been working, Sir Henry. I gained the respect of the vampires by out-hunting them, outsmarting them, and then organizing them these past 300 years. I have even set up camps in every forest of the kingdom in my honor, and they all bow to me. Now, good for you, I muttered. Gregoriet frowned at me for a moment, and I knew I'd nearly tipped him to my plan. I quickly shook my head like I was trying to get rid of intrusive thoughts and then offered the master a tentative smile. Werewolves are much smarter than vampires, I said. So it makes sense. He murmured. Yes, I suppose it does. When they changed me, they thought I was some stupid experiment for their entertainment, of course. But, alas, Henry, I became the most powerful dark creature of them all, and I intend to create more werewolf vampires to join me in a war against Lupercalia. Ah yes, there it was. The reason that he had done all of this in the first place. I stared at him blankly for a moment while I hoped that the king and Greyback had found the Moon Knights. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep this bastard busy. But, Master, I said, why would you wage a war against the kingdom that you used to love so much? Why wouldn't I wage a war against the kingdom that abandoned me and celebrated my ruination? He shot back without missing a beat. The goddess betrayed me. My own country reduced me to a number, just one of those knights that never returned from battle. There are many who disappear, I said. Bah! He snapped and shook his head. Do you know I hid here in the temple of my family after the last Gregoriet had left, and nobody came looking for me. I hate the kingdom of Lupercalia, for I have been the victim of every shred of evil that is in this place. I have been overlooked by the Lupercalians, and I know exactly what kind of darkness and carelessness this kingdom is capable of. Oh man, there was no convincing this guy. Part of me was super pissed off that this guy was so tortured by his personal demons that he'd literally waged a war against the entire kingdom of Lupercalia. But I was a knight and not a therapist, so the only thing I could do was fight. In a weird way, I was super aware that this wasn't just about wanting to fight those who had done him wrong. Seemed like more than anything he just wanted brethren to spend his time with like he'd had in his former life. There's a better way of finding new friends, I finally said. If that's what you're looking for, because it seems like you're lonely more than anything. And waging a war and enslaving werewolves by making them into vampires isn't going to make them like you. For a second the master just looked up at me and paused. He gulped before raising an eyebrow. Sir Henry, he said, it is far too late for that. I have been alone now for hundreds of years. Sometimes I can feel my heart in my chest even though the blood no longer runs there. I know it's calcified by now, but I still feel it. But you don't have to plunge the kingdom into war, I said. If you were to present yourself to the king. It's not war I want, he growled. The war is only the beginning. What I want, Sir Henry, is to plunge Lupercalia into complete darkness. The master grinned while I gawked at him. I was hoping he was just speaking metaphorically, but the look on his face suggested otherwise. What do you mean? I asked. How is that even possible? Tonight is the oblation, he said, and his eyes misted over as he stared into the distance and imagined all of his maniacal plans. But my plan is not only to birth an army in my image. I've moved far beyond that simple plan. No, if my magic succeeds, then tonight is the first of many. Period of darkness will ensue, and Lupercalia will be in a permanent state of ablation. The moon will never shine down on the kingdom again, and the moon goddess will be cast away, just as she cast me away. But you can't, I shouted. Can't I? He asked with a shallow laugh. After all of my years of suffering? The body can only take so much pain, Sir Henry. Even mortals are allowed to die of anguish when they have lost everything that they once loved. But I was robbed of that privilege. I endured a burden that no creature should have to carry. And if I am to be robbed of humanity, then I will act accordingly. Lupercalia will become as dark as my very soul. I could feel the fur standing on my back as he told me of his plan. Even though I was very much a warm-blooded mammal, I felt like my insides had run cold. Lupercalia plunged into darkness? I thought that this was a plan for the vampires to take over the land, like they'd always wanted. But this was so much more. The master would destroy the moon goddess as well, and the whole country would sink into eternal darkness. It was beyond evil, and I wasn't even sure if I could stop him. Chapter 14. Not if we can help it, Gregoriat. A voice boomed through the temple. I raised my own sword then, and a quick glance toward the door revealed that Greyback was there, and from the sounds of it they'd found the Moon Knights and freed them. Seems your plan might not be so simple after all, I said with a grin as I turned back to the master. I never thought it would be, the master growled. Our eyes locked for a moment, but then another vampire jumped out from behind one of the columns. The vampire charged toward me, and I was forced to jump back as the vampire swung an axe at my head. But Charles had made it inside the temple by then, and I saw him run forward. At the same moment, he lifted his moon sword over his head and sliced through the vampire's neck in one swift movement. The axe fell to the ground as the corpse toppled into a line of columns, and though Charles's blow hadn't completely decapitated the vampire, the head came off when it cracked against the heartstone. Charles! I shouted when another vampire in a blue tunic jumped out at us. Charles scrambled away as the vampire tried to slash him with its claws. Swung my blade toward the fiend's back, but the vampire moved aside easily. Turned to face me, and I had to admit the bastard was fucking scary. The vile, hulking creature towered at 7 feet, and he looked stacked as fuck. Blue blood dribbled down his chin and stained his shirt, and when he bared his teeth at me I could see the inside of his mouth was blue as well. What a feast you've given me! He cackled as he swiped at me with his claws. Fuck you! I growled as I swung at the vampire again. The vampire ducked beneath my sword, but Charles was there to take another swing as well. The vampire was off balance for a moment as it stumbled away from Charles, so my fellow knight and I charged toward the hulking vampire. The vampire dropped to the floor in a move straight out of a Hollywood movie, and then rolled away before I could adjust my aim. The bloodsucker then sprang to his feet right next to Charles and grabbed the other knight's gauntlet. I saw Charles jerk his hand away as he brought his sword up, but the vampire danced away again with the metal glove in his possession. The vampire grinned as he waved the glove like a trophy, but then he bared his fangs and lunged toward Charles's exposed hand. Charles swung his blade, which the vampire ducked beneath, and then I heard the knight grunt as the vampire slammed into him. I saw the fangs latch onto Charles's paw just as I buried my sword in the vampire's back, and blue blood spattered on the floor as I yanked my moon sword from between the vampire's shoulder blades. I'll finish this one, Charles declared as he sliced through the vampire's neck. You'll need this, I said as I grabbed the gauntlet and tossed it to Charles. Thank you, Hank, he said as he slipped it back on. 2 more vampires leaped at us, but these were smaller and clumsier. I sliced through the torso of one, and the top half simply fell off the bottom half of its body. Another head rolled by my feet at the same moment, and when I looked at Charles I saw that he'd cut the head off the second vampire. For a moment no more vampires attacked us, so I could look around at the unfolding battle. I had no idea where all the vampires had been hiding, but there were a hell of a lot of them. The Moon Knights were dealing with the bloodsuckers easily, but there were so many that the knights weren't escaping unscathed. I could see puddles of blue blood smeared across the floor, and most of the knights were clearly injured. Where the hell is the master? I asked. I don't see him, Charles replied as he swatted away another vampire. We have to find him, I said, before he can finish his plan. Laniatus Luminous, one of the Moon Knights shouted. Laniatus Luminous. A few more voices joined in. Laniatus Luminous. I looked at Charles, who started to join in the chant as we buried our swords deep in the chests and necks of the vampires, who were now coming at us from all angles. Laniatus Luminous. I started to shout with each blow, even though I didn't know what it meant. Something about the sound of all of our voices together made me feel like I wasn't just one fighter, but rather part of a large body that was fighting against a common enemy. The adrenaline pumped through me, and I knew that this was what it really meant to be part of an army. I felt the rhythm of the chant in my bones, and it picked up speed as we lunged and parried. We were moving like one giant body by then, and I let myself be carried along by the group mind. There was no thought, just kill and move on to the next vampire. We were moving so fast that the killing became a blur, and I barely even registered each time I swung my blade and hit something. Yet the vampires kept coming, and I could feel my muscles starting to tire from the exertion. And then one of the wolves howled. It started off low, almost like a growl, but it soon turned into the classic wolf howl. The other wolves started howling as well, and then I heard a loud crack. A moment later I heard more cracking, and when I finally stopped to look around, I saw that all the columns in the temple were starting to split apart from the sheer force of our howls. "That's old magic," one of the vampires hissed. "You stupid dogs. Your goddess is too weak to provide the light protection that you are trying to achieve." The vampire had black, scraggly hair and looked like the human embodiment of a cigarette, with pale yellow skin and gangly legs. If I didn't know better, I would have thought that it was Nick Cage in some vampire role. "I don't need the goddess to kill you," I shouted at the lithe vampire. I swung my blade at his neck, but the vampire dodged out of the way. He hissed at me and then ducked behind one of the columns as I took another swing at him. My blade slammed into the stone, and large chunks of rock tumbled to the floor. The vampire tried to run toward another column, but he ran into another vampire that had just lost an arm. The pair were tangled up for a few seconds, but that was all the time I needed. I plunged my blade into the monster's back and twisted. Black goop spilled out of the wound and stained the floor, and the vampire gasped as it tried to wriggle free. I twisted the blade one more time just to be sure, and then I felt gravity start to pull the lifeless body to the ground. "Damn it," I muttered when I realized the vampire wasn't going to just slide off my blade. I could hear more columns starting to crumble and dust drifted up my nose as I dropped the vampire on the ground. I had to step on its back to keep it still, while I pulled the blade free, and I grimaced when a few vital organs came out. With the sword, something crashed into my back, and I swung around with my blade at the ready. But instead of a vampire, I found myself face to face with none other than the king, who was covered in vampire blood, but didn't appear to be hurt himself. "Sir Henry," the king said as he drove his sword through another vampire. "Sire," I started to reply and then froze. A monstrous creature had just appeared behind the king that looked like a zombie panther. Its rotting flesh clung onto a skeletal frame, and the eyes were a lifeless milky white, but it still had fangs worthy of a saber-tooth. "Sire," I shouted as I tried to push the king behind me. The panther lunged, and both the king and I brought our blades down on the beast. I managed to graze the panther's side and tear through its decaying ribcage, but the creature seemed unfazed by my attack. Shit. It retaliated with a flurry of swipes, and the king repelled most of them with a few flicks of his powerful and more magical moon sword. Each time the king's blade clashed against the monster's paw, a tiny ray of light emanated from the end, and I wondered which powerful stone had given it the power to do that. The panther seemed to decide that it couldn't get past the king's blade, so it suddenly swiped at me and left a deep gouge in my knee. A burning pain surged through my body, and I could feel my leg piece start to fill up with my own blood. If I hadn't been fighting on pure adrenaline already, I probably would have had to sit down. "Henry, keep striking at it," the king shouted. The two of us unleashed a relentless assault on the creature with our moon swords, and though the cat was fast, we were faster. I timed my strike so that I always hit opposite the king and always in between his own blows. Eventually, I even managed to cut off one of its front limbs. "Ha!" the king shouted as he sliced off the panther's head. "Well done, Sir Henry." I grinned at the king for a moment and then looked around for my next target. It was hard to see anything with all the dust, but with the columns now gone, I had a better view of the whole temple. I could even admire what had probably been a beautiful building in its prime. But then my eyes spotted a stained glass door. It was being propped open by the body of a moon knight that I couldn't identify, and my stomach churned as the body started to move. I was sure the knight was dead, but it looked like someone was pulling it into a small room. Behind the door, I could see a large shadowy silhouette moving around behind the stained glass. It was werewolf-shaped, and at first I hoped that it might be a fellow knight who was trying to move the body somewhere it could be easily retrieved after the fighting was over. But why would a moon knight do that during the middle of a battle? I knew the answer was that no moon knight would do that, and I realized that the shadowy figure had to be the master. "There he is," I said. "It's the master," and he has the body of a knight. We have to stop him, the king replied. The king and I ran across the temple toward the door. A few vampires tried to stop us, but our fellow Moon Knights were there to clear our path. We nearly made it, but one of the vampires made it through the gamut of knights, and, before I could even react, launched himself into the air right at the king. The vampire slammed into the king's chest so hard that the king fell to his knees. I heard the king gasp, but when I started to turn around, the king shook his head. Go on, Hank, the king ordered. Don't let him get away. No, I said as another vampire pounced on the king. Go, the king shouted as he tossed the first vampire to the ground. You can't let Gregoriat turn even one night. I hated the idea of leaving the king, but there were still enough Moon Knights on their feet that I was sure he would be safe. I finally nodded and turned away from the king to face the door, and then I shoved it open so hard that it smashed against the stone wall behind it. Come out and face me, you coward, I shouted as I looked around the room. The space in the center was brightly lit with torches and candles, so I had a good view of the giant stone slab that stood there and the dead Moon Knight that had been nailed spread eagle to the stone. I felt my stomach roil as I watched the blue blood pour over the side of the stone, and then my anger drove me toward the altar. Sir Henry, the master said as he appeared from one of the dark recesses. You've come just in time for the ceremony. As I invoke the vampire magic of darkness, this dead Moon Knight will act as a sacrifice. The goddess protectors will die one by one, and I will give them a new life as my followers. No fucking way, I said. We will never be your followers. Then why are you here? He laughed. To kill me? Why not give up the fight? Henry, it's already lost. The floors of the Temple of Gregoriat are stained with blue blood. Our forces will keep fighting until you are dead. And for those who are left, you will either follow me by choice or by force. What do you think, Sir Henry? Are you ready to follow me into the darkness? No way, I said and leaped toward the vampire. You can't kill me, he shouted, and the abomination drew his sidearm. Burgundy red spiked mace. It was a weapon for royalty, but twisted from any sort of noble purpose like its master. We circled each other like the dogs we were, and then with a growl that bounced off the walls of the dark room, we launched into motion. I lunged forward and aimed my sword at the master's chest, but he sidestepped with a fluid and precise movement. Before I could spin around, he struck me in the shoulder hard enough to rattle the teeth in my head. My shoulder armor was bashed in badly and I was bleeding. I had a feeling bones were broken, but my adrenaline was keeping me in the fight. I darted back a few steps while I tried to figure out my next move. Even though the master looked weak, I just learned how strong this guy really was. It made sense, since he had both the strength of a werewolf and a vampire, though I'd hoped that being turned into a vampire might have sapped him of some of his werewolf powers, especially since he was turned during the last ablation. I made a couple of feints to bait him into dropping his defenses, but the master knew every trick since he'd trained as a knight as well, and he easily slipped away. It was clear I wasn't going to win this with just my blade, so when the bastard snapped his fangs like an angry dog, I followed my instincts and snapped back. Our jaws locked in a struggle for dominance, and our growls echoed around the chamber. I could feel my knee buckling from the damage I'd taken, and it felt like he'd broken my collarbone with the blow to my shoulder. I was already worn down by the fighting, so I had to end this quickly. The master suddenly grabbed my chest plate and then pushed back as hard as he could. I spun away from him and smacked into the stone slab so hard that I almost fell over backwards, but I was braced by the body of the dead Moon Knight. Don't worry, the master hissed. You'll have your turn on the table. The one-time knight lunged toward me with his mace over his head to deliver a death blow, but I was ready. I kicked him squarely in his emaciated belly, and then I heard the sound of his sinews tearing and his bones cracking as he slammed against the stone wall. I was charging forward before the master even hit the ground, and I swung my blade so fast that it whistled as it sliced through the air. I felt the blade slam into something soft, but then the master growled and spun away. I could see a trail of blackish blue blood down his arm, and I quickly brought the blade up for the finishing strike. But the master ducked so fast that I barely had time to register that he'd moved, and when he sprang up, his teeth dug into my skull. I yelped and shoved him away, but when I looked down, I saw something triangular and furry on the floor and I realized that he had bitten off my ear. Shit. I needed to kill this fucker once and for all. Pathetic. He laughed and then lifted his mace for another swipe. But this time I was prepared. Instead of lunging at him with my sword, I lifted the blade and slashed it horizontally across his body to intercept his blow. His arm came down on my sword and before I knew it, it was sliced clean off at the wrist with the mace still locked in its grip. My sword fell to the ground with the impact and the awkward slashing angle. But before I could retrieve it, the bastard kicked it out of the way. So now, it was a dogfight and I had no fucking clue how I could beat this guy though. I knew I had to. The master growled at me, but he didn't charge in right away and I could hear him panting as well. I could see the bone sticking out of his arm and I knew that was his weak point. I snapped at the vampire and before he realized what I was doing, I clamped down on the exposed bone and muscle. He howled in pain and tried to twist his arm free and then his own wolf instincts took over as he tried to clamp his jaws around my neck. I released his arm and met his teeth with my own, and once again our jaws were locked together. Our growls filled the air, and for a moment the only thing I was aware of was the angry face that was mere inches from mine. I had to destroy this abomination, but I knew I couldn't do it with brute strength. Even reduced to one arm, the guy was stronger than I was. The only way I could win this was with the magic of my sword, but that meant I had to unlatch my jaw and scramble away as quickly as possible. The master's jaw was starting to snap closed around mine, so I gave him one hard shove and then darted into the shadows where I'd last seen my sword. Come on, goddess, I muttered. Just one last miracle. You're determined, I'll give you that, the master proclaimed. But it won't save you. I heard his footsteps padding toward me, and I felt desperation grip my heart as I searched the shadows, and then my eye finally spotted the distinct glimmer of moon silver and the hilt that bore such a striking resemblance to my direwolf. I threw myself toward the sword like I was sliding into home plate as the master leaped toward me. My hand found the hilt, and I rolled over with the weapon at the ready. I had just enough time to see the master falling toward me, and then the anger in his eyes turned to surprise when he saw the blade in my hand. Then I drove the blade upwards into the soft underside of his jaw, and the moon sword burst out the top of his skull with a sound that reminded me of a firecracker exploding. All the pain and disappointment vanished from his eyes, and for a moment it looked like something akin to relief took their place. He took a few more erratic breaths, and then he collapsed on top of me. Holy shit. By the grace of the goddess, I'd done it. I'd killed the master and saved Lupercalia. I pushed the body off of me and stood up slowly. An eerie silence filled the room as I tried to regain my breath, and then I staggered over to the stone slab. It took everything I had not to sit down again, but I couldn't rest.